Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham coming at you today, nearly live. We are in Ottawa, Ontario, with a different episode for you today. Normally, we are nearly live, but here's an episode that we did live a couple weeks ago. We had a crowd, a bit of an audience. It was certainly not for me. It was part of Beth Robertson's book launch for Science of the Seance, Transnational Networks and Gendered Bodies in the Study of Psychic Phenomena, 1918 to 1940. This was actually the release of the paperback version. The hard copy came out in 2016. And Beth and I actually shared an office this semester at Carleton, and we would be in there on Tuesday afternoons. And I asked her a few months ago if she would want to come on the podcast to talk about the book, and she had this great idea of why don't we do a live version of the podcast to go along with the book launch and have a different energy to it. So I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. There's some ambient noise throughout the episode, the coffee machine, the door opening and closing as people came in. The location where we were was Black Squirrel Books in Old Ottawa South on Bank Street. So it was open, so there was people around us through the whole thing. I think Beth and my voices are pretty clear through the show. We do open it up for questions at one point. A couple of the questions are a little hard to hear. I tried to amplify them and clear them up as much as I could. So I apologize if those aren't as clear as perhaps they could be. But we tried our best to ensure that everyone had a chance to ask questions. And we're thankful for the people at Black Squirrel for having us. It was a miserable, rainy night here in Ottawa, as so many nights this spring have been. But I'm pleased that we got such a great turnout for the book launch, and it was a fun night. I really enjoyed the conversation with Beth, and we would encourage you to check out the book. So without any further ado, here is the discussion that we had at Black Squirrel Books with Beth Robertson. So we are here at the book launch of Science of the Seance, Transnational Networks and Gendered Bodies in the Study of Psychic Phenomenon, 1918 to 1940, with the author, Beth Robertson. Beth, welcome.
Thank you.
And we should note we're here with people. Yeah. First time we've ever had a crowd for our podcast because of Beth. So congratulations. This is the paperback launch. The hardcover's been out for a while now because the official date was 2016. So getting to paperback, always exciting. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
So for anyone who doesn't know, the book Science of the Seance, I mean, people I think know generally what a seance is, but how are you approaching this, the topic, and what generally is the book about?
That's without boring you. It's essentially looking at the seance, if everyone's familiar, maybe from high school, of like joining your hands and lighting candles around a Ouija board. Well, in the 1920s and 30s, it was about a moment in time where people had been taking it more seriously. And it was probably the last push to try and make the scientific study of paranormal phenomenon into an actual science, as opposed to a religious phenomenon. And it was just before J.B. Rhine, if anyone remembers his name. At Duke University, he set up this kind of parapsychology laboratory. So it was just before he was about to launch that. And so it's kind of like this kind of key niche moment in which kind of a lot of things are happening, and it could have taken multiple directions. So this book is, in many ways, kind of tries to look, and it takes a very kind of narrow focus of looking at a set of actors, a set of individuals who communicated and shared experimental methods and technologies and even spirits across borders, from Britain to the US to Canada.
And why, 1918, so the end of the First World War, and in teaching about pop culture, I've talked about how people are consumed by death in that moment. So is that related to why this interest comes up starting around that time, that people have gone through the death and now want to deal with that in some way? Is that part of the process?
You can't deny that is part of the issue. Actually, one of the kind of the key people in this book, Dr. Thomas Glendinning Hamilton in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He was one of the head physicians during the influenza epidemic shortly after the war. And arguably, at least one of the reasons why he started, or what kind of might have begun his interest is so actually, while he was a physician caring for people, he actually brought the influenza strand back with him home, and his young son toddler ended up dying as a result from influenza. And at least, if not him, it was definitely like a driver for his wife to become more interested in that. But then it becomes, I guess, my critique of a lot of the studies in this era that have been done is usually people kind of say, well, it's just because of the war and because of this moment, and that's the only reason why people are interested in this. And I argue that there's actually a few other reasons why individuals, and even if this does play a part in it, it's kind of longing for lost loved ones, it doesn't necessarily discount what they were doing, or it doesn't mean that we should take it less seriously.
Right, because this is a topic that tends to be taken not very seriously, right? Like
yes,
people,
yes.
Seances, it's all sort of out there, and not, like, especially on TV shows, movies, like people don't take it seriously. But so here's a moment where people want to take it seriously, and in doing so, what are the methods through which they're trying to do this? Like, what is the science of it, and how are they trying to prove these things?
Yeah. So, well, in the book itself, in kind of a series of chapters in which they kind of document some of the tactics they try to take. And just so you know, my daughter's here on my lap, so the whimpering child that's who she is. Anyway, her name is Tam Tam. Yes. Yeah, and so and I began actually with and actually the steps they take to make it into a science, I find particularly interesting because it in many ways reflects what these individuals believed were the steps one needed to take to move something from being like a more kind of spiritual or personal endeavor to something that was much more science that could be backed by kind of university and academic knowledge. But in that respect, it actually shows in kind of an interesting way and from an unusual angle shows how sciences go from being considered marginal to more accepted. And so, but in this case, it is never accepted. So it's constantly in this kind of science in the making, as I put it in the book.
Right, that seems to have a relevance right now because so much of discussions around science, people say, well, look at when science is wrong, and science has been proven to be wrong later. And here's a case where you have the scientific community engaging in something that like they want to prove something that isn't there. Like, so is this a case that it might be damaging to science and the community for engaging in this sort of stuff?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of the kind of the backlash of, and this actually another interesting is kind of this also kind of is just before another era when increasing challenges to the scientific framework. Usually when maybe the common person thinks about the post-war era, particularly the post-war era, kind of after 1940, they kind of assume that kind of science is well established, and as other historians, particularly like Michael Gordin, he wrote this book called about the kind of the birth of the modern fringe that actually happened in the post-war era. So this is kind of another instance where there were individuals who were trying to kind of push at the boundaries of science itself, and that in turn not only caused dissension among the people who were doing it, but also from those outside it. And often, interestingly enough, when you read books, particularly after actually the closing of Duke University with J.B. Ryan, which happened in the 1970s. There's a kind of almost a dramatic change in tone. It goes from kind of taking it sort of seriously and to kind of dismissing it. And this dismissal is, I think, a product of trying to kind of maintain those supposedly clear-cut boundaries.
Right. So in the subtitle, there's two big words there with transnational agenda. Let's start with transnational. What is the transnational element of this? Because sort of so far you've talked about seems to be a very localized group of people. Mm-hmm. So where's the transnational element come into the book?
Well, it's a small group of people, but they're actually so there's individuals, and particularly look at Eric Dingwall, he was a person who was involved with the British Society of Psychical Research quite a lot, and he was actually initially sent to the U.S. to investigate on behalf of that British Society, at least some of this phenomenon that this network was looking at. And then there's individuals from Canada. So you have T. Glenn Hamilton from Winnipeg, Manitoba. You have Jenny O'Hara Pincock from Kitchener, or St. Catharines, sorry. And then you have individuals who are kind of working at the nexus in the American Society, and particularly two individuals, Leroy Crandon and his wife. Well, her actual name is Mina Crandon, but she adopts the pseudonym of Marjorie, and now has become she's more known as Marjorie than as Mina now. And they become kind of at the center of this, in many ways, kind of drawing these figures all together in kind of interesting ways.
And how do they do that? I mean, 1920s, and it seems like if there's one person or two people in each spot that potentially could be marginalized within their own space, it seems like maintaining that network would be a difficult thing to do if there's no support locally. So I'm just curious about the process through which even they find each other.
Well, interestingly enough, actually, what I contend is actually the reason why they were making these transnational links was actually to strengthen their authority, because as other historians of science and tech have pointed out, starting with Bruno Latour, is that that it's to make a science successful, you must make it seem universal and almost ahistorical, and so you must kind of remove it from the messy process of humans. Right. And by kind of making these transnational links, it makes their study kind of placeless without kind of context. And this is important where they feel for establishing these links. And so each of these individuals kind of came to this study separately, but they begin to be kind of drawn closer, not only by particular mediums, so individuals who are actually making contact or who are kind of recognized as people who are kind of adept at making those kind of connections between two worlds, as you say, but also through spirits, which is interesting. And my treatment of spirits is probably a little bit different than what you'd find in most books about this subject.
In what way? Why is that particular element so unique here?
Well, it's because I refuse to be kind of adamant about whether or not I kind of ignore the question of whether or not they are real. Right. Yeah. And I instead actually look at what they're actually doing within the space of the seance, and within this, and how they're actually thought of by the individuals who, whether you believe that they're there or not, they believe that they're there, and they believe that they're interacting with this phenomenon in some way. And so I borrow from Donna Haraway's idea of kind of subjective knowledges, and I try to understand how that comes to be. And in the process, you realize actually how much hinges on these spirits, on these entities, and they become kind of interesting enough kind of key actors within this kind of larger group.
Right. I guess it's one of those things where, in a world of alternative facts, it doesn't matter if they're real; it just matters if people think they're real. And that's where the power and the meaning comes from. Yeah. And whether or not they're real or not is incidental to the rest of the process.
Yes. Yeah. And contemporarily we talk about, we live in the era of alternative facts, but we've been living in an era of alternative facts for quite some time now, as many historians would acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. So the other part of this is the gender element, and this is something that I mean, for as little as I know about the topic, this is another element of what I know little about, and in terms of how a space like this could be gendered in a way that is notable and speaks to how the process played out. So I'm just wondering, in what way does this get gendered, and what are the ramifications of that? Well,
I'm actually not the first scholar to recognize that this becomes kind of very implicated within kind of gendered understandings. Mm-hmm. Alex Owen wrote this kind of pivotal work that looked at 19th century spiritualism, for instance, and kind of identified the characteristics of the medium, this person kind of making these contacts, as in line and almost in perfect parallel with ideals of the perfect woman, or femininity, and so like passive, intuitive, emotional, irrational, in connection with the body, but not so much the mind. So these are all elements that come out to play within this as well. But it has kind of an added significance in the process of these individuals kind of attempting to make this into a science, in that the way that kind of scientist is coded at this time is kind of intrinsically coded in a kind of a masculine sense.
Right.
And so these ideals of kind of objectivity, impersonality, rationality, knowledge, authority are all coded in particular ways that kind of connote or suggest who is what bodies, what people are able to do this kind of science, and what people are not, and what people who make the best subjects as well, best scientific subjects.
Okay, and is that part of the process through which it would be accepted or dismissed? And is that really just a means to an end, to gender it in that way?
Well, it becomes kind of a tactic for making it, again, like much like these kind of transnational links, this becomes another tactic that is employed to try and make it seem like more like a science. The difficulties, they come up with a number of difficulties, however. One is that actually, and even since the late 19th century, despite these kind of efforts to make it into kind of a more scientific study, women are very engaged with this kind of search for paranormal, and actually at the very beginning of spiritualism, they are key. They are at the crux of it, and because, ironically, it's because women are kind of coded as the perfect medium. They become very important to this project. But what happens is they become so key to it, and particularly with the kind of like changing ideas of gender roles within the 1920s and 30s, and particularly because of the kind of the strong personalities of some of these mediums who are supposed to be passive, but are not. It raises challenges to trying to kind of present these kind of binaries of you have a scientific man studying a kind of a feminized scientific subject.
So I don't want to monopolize the time here, so I'll allow our crowd here, our audience, if you have questions. Now, be aware that we've done 100 of these, and I've never let anybody else ask a question before. So this is a big deal for me to turn over the show. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free.
Well, I guess I'm sort of interested in the methodology that you're talking about, just taking the spiritual sensation as given. How does that work? Are there sort of patterns you can see in terms of the way people perceive these things, and are they? I mean, it's transnational, but are there ways that people tend to perceive spirits in the U.S. as opposed to Canada or Europe?
That's a very interesting question. Interestingly enough, the kind of the theories and experiences of individuals who are participate within seances, it was very varied, extremely so, in terms of, and that personality actually was in some ways important, because the more kind of particular an experience was, the more it actually suggested that they were actually contacting individual, real live individuals. Yeah. So if someone like Jenny O'Hara Pincock, for instance, like one of her first experiences that convinced her that this was real or that was something worthy to study, was that her husband was an osteopath, and he supposedly, as a spirit, gave her a treatment that was exactly the way he would have done in life. And that experiences like these were what kind of convinced her that this is like, no, I'm actually contacting an individual that I knew in life. He touched me in this particular way that no one else could. And so so there's this kind of particularity to it, which also kind of becomes problematic when you're trying to make it into a science, because then there are others who are insisting that, no, we have to make this measurable. You need to be able to graph it and be able to identify patterns and block out any any kind of external influences in order to try and kind of boil this down and see what is the kind of at the root of all of this. So there is this kind of constant tension between real and unreal, or between kind of the particular and the universal that's happening. The one thing, but in terms of kind of suggesting like national experiences within all of that, it becomes extra fascinating because the main spirit, or one of the main spirits at the kind of the center of this, was a Canadian. And he was like a worker in life. He died in a railroad accident. And it is only after death that he becomes very adept at the scientific method, which is interesting. But it depends on kind of where he is. So where his Canadianness becomes more emphasized. And so you have this group in Winnipeg who experience Walter, as he was known, and he was actually the brother of Mina Crandon, or Marjorie, in the States, who was also born in Canada but had moved to the U.S., to Boston, and he so like the way Teaglin and Hamilton, for instance, kind of identifies traits, characteristic ways of speaking and in carrying on, but he identifies as distinctly Canadian, and it's in a weird sort of way, a way of him claiming ownership, at least in part, of that spirit, but also a way of him again identifying these particularities that somehow kind of prove that this person is real.
So it's like the culture of how you perceive the spirit, or who the spirit is.
Yes, exactly, right, and that becomes very important to. It is adopted at the same time as this kind of attempt to try and make it seem universal as well.
I was just thinking in Mexico, there are all these very, very old legends about spirits that come back. So it comes out of the history of the conquest and various things like that. I'm just wondering if there any you have Walter, the railway worker, but are there any that are older spirit mythologies?
Yeah, that's interesting. They identified. It depended on what seance you went to, like of what kind of mythology they were going. One aspect of this, and it becomes very racialized as well, and this is, this was a very typical thing right from the 19th century, is to have indigenous spirits come into the seance, and they suggested this sort of kind of like universal historical. So Black Hawk, who was an indigenous resistance leader, he comes back at one point in this, and he plays this kind of key role within the seance itself. And even though he's kind of well known in the 19th century, the way he speaks is a way of suggesting this kind of historical mythological element to it. But it has these very like intense, obviously racialized overtones to it as well. And it reflects what largely white sitters imagined indigenous people to be, not so much what indigenous people actually were.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just curious about your sources. Can you talk a little bit about where you found out about it?
Yeah. A good many of the sources come from the University of Manitoba. They have actually one of the most impressive collections of paranormal research in the world, I would say, that compares to what's in Cambridge as well. So the Society for the British Society has most of its records there. So some of the images that you see in this book were actually of Eric Dingwall. So he commissioned these photographs, and they're now in those archives. And then the University of Waterloo has Jenny O'Hara-Pincock's collection of papers as well, and there's kind of extensive notes. And she was most interested in a medium named William Carthuser, who and he actually, before he met January Pincock, he had a joint seance with Marjorie. And so there's interesting kind of interplays and connections happening on that front. And there are people who kind of know both of them as well, and they definitely know one another during this time. And so it's so this so there's that collection, and then there's the ASPR, the American Association, is actually still in operation, and they have their records in New York. Actually, I think I remember being told it was like nearby where John Lennon was shot. So it's and that I think that was actually my most interesting research experience I have ever had in my life, going there, because like unlike at University of Manitoba or University of Waterloo, these individuals are carrying on a lineage of these research, and they are still kind of advocates for paranormal research. So, and have very definite opinions about some of its history as well, which again kind of posed a few challenges here and there.
Well, it's interesting, like to have an experience like that, right, these interesting research experiences, in writing about something like this, like just personally dealing with this subject matter. Was that difficult at any level?
I've had a number of people like come up to me and like ask me like, can you connect me to my grandmother? Or do you have any, like more recently, do you have any tips? I want to hold a seance. Do you have any tips? And my answer is like, no, actually I'm the wrong person for you to ask. I'm an academic. I'm irreligious, like, so I don't have, anyway, like I don't have any kind of connection in that regard. And so sometimes it is interesting in writing on that subject because sometimes individuals kind of gravitate towards you hoping for that I myself may hold some secrets, and unfortunately, and as dull as it may seem, I don't.
but people want answers, Beth. People
yes.
want clear, definitive answers on these sorts of issues.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm curious about the end date of 1940. 1918, clean start date. I understand that. 1940 is not quite as clean of an end date.
Yes.
So I'm just a little curious as to why you went there and what that decision-making process was.
Yeah, so it wasn't actually, you suppose that it was because of the beginning of World War II that I pulled the plug on all of this. It was actually because some key actors within this network actually died. And they started dying off in the early 1930s, either dying or kind of backing away from this study for various reasons. And so 1940 is the year that Leroy Crandon dies, and Hamilton died 1935. And in many ways, the kind of the individuals that made this network happen within this moment in time begins to kind of unravel and fall apart.
So the movement itself sort of, like, so the movement is the people are essential to the movement and the network, and nobody picks up the torch once they're gone to do it.
Yes, at least in terms of this network. So sometimes, like historians, we like to pretend that it's like, oh well, the reason why I'm stopping is because it all ends right now, and that's not the case. For instance, like interest in paranormal research would have like other resurgences later on in the 1960s, the 1980s even. But this network in particular that I was looking at seems to kind of unravel.
Okay. And do the people themselves, once they're gone, I'm curious about this sort of this celebration of death and sort of the mythology of it. It seems to me that the people themselves who are studying it could then be almost held up as figures for people who engage in seances, and like people, like they would look at them and say we're involved in the world and in this world and studying it in a way, and now I want to engage with them in a seance, sort of thing. You know what I mean? Like, did that happen? Is there a legacy of them within the community, within the seance community? Like, so even though they're dead, the network is sort of coming apart. Are they still celebrated figures, or are they celebrated figures within that community?
So that's interesting. So in one of the chapters near the end, I actually talk about spirit scientists. And this, again, I kind of point at this as like maybe kind of one more instance of this kind of seance, or the unraveling of this science, is because the spirits, you start losing clarity on who is experimenting with whom. And so a number of these, so William Crookes, for instance, and he's kind of held up as the preeminent psychical researcher that began. He was a kind of a very well-known chemist, celebrated 19th century scientist to this day. The Crookes tube was due to this person, but he was also very interested in psychical research, and he ends up dying just before the war begins, but he comes back fairly soon afterwards. So like the mid-1920s, he begins reappearing in a number of these seances, and he becomes a key actor in a number of the seances that this book examines. And he is conducting experiments, kind of giving advice in terms of kind of experimental controls, developing spiritual technology that the real life people don't quite get, but they try to kind of figure out what exactly he's doing. So it becomes very interesting. But it does signal that these people who have passed on are still kind of active players within this.
And then just finally, in terms of sort of the modern ramification, I'm always interested in how we can use stuff today, right? And what does the book and what does this moment in time tell us about the way we look at science and how we try to, non-scientists particularly, how we can try and understand science, look at science, and then use it to inform ourselves in looking at the world around us?
Yes. Well, it does. For one, it shows you like how science can be kind of swallowed up in culture and then kind of spit out again in interesting ways. And I said that without kind of thinking, because actually women are actually spewing paranormal substance. So there is kind of a literal connection that I didn't initially mean, but anyway. But there's also one thing that I found interesting. So like there's been like over like 30 years of research of why certain STEM fields are having difficulty including women within their fields. And most people probably would look at my book and like not think immediately that this is something that could speak to that. But one thing that and weirdly enough, as I've increasingly been asked, how do we get more women in STEM? And I'm like, I'm a humanist. I'm not sure if I'm the person you should be asking, but okay. But it's at the same time, it does actually, by studying this kind of this science unmade, or this kind of failed science, this science in the making, you get actually a very clear sense of these kind of embodied prerequisites for making scientific claims, for kind of claiming knowledge, claiming ideals of rationality, and they become the way they're performed, because this is sort of like Bruno Latour would refer to science as a black box. And this is a box that is left open, right. And so you get to see all of those kind of messy interactions, and it becomes glaringly apparent, even almost in a cartoonish sort of way, of how gendered all of these prerequisites are, how racialized these prerequisites are, like how, and it begins to kind of open up that conversation that maybe it's not just a matter of women leaning in more, it's to become more a part of STEM, that it's actually something that's much more systemic about how we understand knowledge, how we understand rationality. And I think this book actually has something to say about that.
Sure, and does that challenge the idea of the objectivity of science? Those barriers and the way it's systematically set up in this way, that maybe it's not that objective, that it leads to a subjectivity based on who is participating in the process and the way in which they look at the world.
Yeah, it's interesting because like all my friends who are scientists, like they completely recognize that they're humans, and they have feelings and emotions, and they can be subjective, and they get up in the morning and have bad days. But there is this kind of idea of science that it is kind of completely objective, that is universal, that is...
I want it to be objective. Like, we all want it to be objective. Yeah.
Yes, but there's limits to that,
Sure.
right? As and if any historian of science would be able to tell you, all these kind of messy processes of when we just kind of got it completely wrong, and someone else had to kind of step in and say, like, well, actually, let's rethink it in this way. So because we're humans, we just have a tendency to make mistakes or go down wrong paths, and so this is not necessarily kind of an attack on science or saying that science should not be believed. I'm kind of a geek of obviously amateur, but obviously kind of like various scientisty things, but at the same time, it's just kind of this acknowledgement that it is a product of humans, it is a product of culture at the same time, so it can never be as kind of pristinely clean as we'd want it to be.
Well, again, the book is Science of the Seance, Transnational Networks and Gendered Bodies in the Study of Psychic Phenomena, 1918 to 1940, through UBC Press. Paperback is out. Buy the book. That's the message, right? Thanks. So there you have it. My conversation with Beth Robertson, author of Science of the Seance, Transnational Networks and Gendered Bodies in the Study of Psychic Phenomena, 1918 to 1940. We would like to thank everyone who came out to the book launch and those who asked questions. We appreciate that, as always. And, of course, our thanks to Black Squirrel Books for being such gracious hosts. And they didn't ask me to do this, but it is a really cool store. If you're in Ottawa, or if you're ever in town and you get a chance to go, it's this really cool used bookstore, and the basement just blew my mind when I went down there. Just books and books and books. It's a really cool spot. So we thank them for their hospitality on a cold and miserable spring night in Ottawa. And of course, our thanks to Beth Robertson for coming on this show. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, it is historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.